Now, there are concerns about MPs being targeted by protesters in recent months since the outbreak of the Israel-Hamas war.
Home Secretary James Cleverly is calling for those pro-Palestinian marches which bring London and grind to every Saturday to stop now.
So we're joined in the studio by sketch writer and columnist for the Daily Telegraph, Madeline Grant. What is your assessment of this situation, Madeline, really, which has been over the last few days with Lee Anderson? What would be the negatives for the Conservative Party if he joins Reform? What does it say? What does it tell the electorate?
Well, I think what it would tell the electorate, it would signal that some would think that it would show that perhaps the Conservative Party is not serious enough about tackling Islamism, for example. I mean, I personally think that what Lee Anderson said was incredibly misguided, and he went too far. There was a grain of truth in what he said, but he took it too far, and it allowed Westminster to do what it loves best, to have a navel-gazing contest, rather than talking about the very real and substantive issue that last week's proceedings in the Commons raised, the fact that our democracy is essentially subverted by the intimidation of protesters.
I agree.
This is the important issue, and now Westminster gets to have its 4-day dialogue about what Lee Anderson said. And I think he did go too far, but there was some truth to what he said.
Yeah.
And he admits he used clumsy language.
Yeah, but he should have apologised for having used clumsy language. And I think it was the word about your mates. I think that was what really took it too far.
Which
and he could have made a similar point without going that far.
Which could have been suggesting a sort of nepotism.
Yes.
Or kind of a sort of corruption in terms of maybe, you know, looking after people, as politicians have done, of any particular religion or ethnicity since the beginning of time, pretty much.
But I think it was Islamists, you know, saying that you're mates with Islamists. That's quite, I mean, if I remember right.
And controlled by them.
Yes, exactly. That was tricky. But I think that now that it looks the Conservative Party, they will be accused of weakness. Lee Anderson is a very effective communicator and has lots of fans. And apparently there are lots of backbench Tory MPs who are upset with the PM because they desperately like having Lee Anderson come to their constituency events because he's a fun speaker and people enjoy hearing from him.
And the MPs I've talked to this week say they didn't need to make him apologise. They just should have said, clarify your remarks.
Yeah.
If he'd clarified his remarks in public, which he would have happily done, we saw the statement he put out, which Tory Central Office suppressed for a couple of days. We brought it onto this programme first. And it was very, very thoughtful, I thought. And I agreed with absolutely pretty much everything he said in it.
Yeah, and I do understand his reservations about apologising, because it is true that as soon as one MP apologises for one thing, that leads to clarion calls from Labour for further apologies for all sorts of other things. They're now saying, oh, let's take the whip off Liz Truss for her sojourns in America. You know, it doesn't necessarily make the problem always go away.
I've heard the comparisons made between Richard Tice meeting Lee Anderson in a Holiday Inn at the weekend. And in fact, Richard Tice gave me a pen when he came in, and it's a Holiday Inn pen, so I'm keeping this as a bit of political memorabilia, by the way. This might be significant.
Did he sign the transfer deal with Lee Anderson? Is that the transfer deal pen?
Is this the pen? But they're drawing comparisons with the famous Tony Blair Gordon Brown meeting in the restaurant, which was called the Granita restaurant.
Oh, yeah.
Is that overstating it a little?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think if Lee Anderson goes, it obviously helps. It helps Reform, because they then have someone who can actually make their points for them in Parliament, rather than relying on, you know, TV and newspapers to get that point across. And it will also distract Westminster from everything else. They're very fickle people in the Westminster lobby, and they'd much rather deal with this than any of the kind of underlying issues facing society. And
the challenge, of course, is that Reform have a recognition issue, and this will put them on the front page of the papers and raise awareness. Let's hear what Sadiq Khan said last night. He was at an award ceremony in London, I believe, and he took the opportunity on stage, of course, as he does, to make a point.
Responsible politicians also know that racism and prejudice, no matter what form it takes, regardless of whether it's anti-Semitism or, yes, Islamophobia, should be countered and condemned, not given a free pass or left unchallenged for electoral gain.
Now, that was at the National Kebab Awards last night.
I wasn't invited.
No, I quite like a kebab. I would have quite liked an invitation. But the room didn't exactly give him a rousing applause, did they, Madeline?
I couldn't quite tell, because if he was in full flow there, maybe it wasn't like a pause for applause. But he's not the most... He's quite an underwhelming speaker.
Yes, he is.
I've often thought that for I mean, say what you like about Boris Johnson and Ken Livingstone. They're both really strong personalities with massive charisma. I don't see how Sadiq Khan, I think, is quite apart from his shoddy ruling of this city, is quite a disappointing replacement for those two.
They were both big figures, weren't they?
Yes, they were.
Big politicians.
And yet, he was voted in as London Mayor.
Oh, yeah.
He's highly likely to win again.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
There was a poll on the front of the Evening Standard last night giving him a 25-point lead.
But that's partly the fault of the Conservatives. I mean, I agree with Susan Hall on a lot, but normally you would choose someone better known. The Conservative candidate. You would choose someone better known and give them real support. Sean Bailey did extremely well, even though CCHQ was not giving him much help. He got 48, I think it was 52-48 at the last mayoral election.
Yeah.
London is by no means a kind of sort of haven of Labour support necessarily. If the Conservatives have given up on London, I'm not sure why they did that.
Yeah, and the Muslim vote, Labour's traditionally relied on the Muslim vote. That is fracturing because of what's happening in Gaza, and there are independent Muslim candidates standing.
And actually, let's see what happens with Rochdale, but if someone like George Galloway or Jeremy Corbyn were to run their own campaign, that would perhaps splinter Labour's vote even more. Yeah,
I think Jeremy Corbyn's going to run again as an independent in his own constituency in Islington. That's my understanding. Yes. He's been the MP for 40 years.
Yes.
OK, Madeline, thank you. Madeline.